You sign the last form 9 months before the ship ever leaves the ground, and that turns out to be the real departure. Not the launch, not the countdown, just a signature that quietly converts if into when. From that morning forward, your body belongs to a crew of 12 and to a single working lifetime spent closing a gap of 4.25 light years. The ship can give you speed, shelter, and enough recycled air to outlast your own skeleton. It cannot give you a way back, because the fuel that would buy a return trip has already been budgeted for going faster instead. 3 days after the signature, an engineer gives you the version that never made it into the recruitment material. The same engine that gets this ship moving fast enough to matter will also, over years of continuous firing, put more radiation through your body than any astronaut alive has ever been cleared to absorb. Tonight, we'll follow one crew, one ship, and one irreversible decision, from the morning it is signed to the only few hours it was ever built to earn. If this is the kind of night you return to, subscribe. It helps this quiet universe keep growing. Let's begin. The signature happens at a metal table under fluorescent light, with a mission director watching you read every page before you're allowed to reach the last one. It is not dramatic. Nobody plays music. The form itself is mostly boilerplate. Insurance riders, next of kin instructions, a paragraph about remains that the director asks you to initial separately so that nobody can later claim they signed it by accident. Somewhere in the middle sits the one clause that actually matters. The ship carries enough propellant to accelerate to cruise speed and, decades later, to make one close pass of the destination system. It does not carry enough to slow down, turn around, and come home. You are not signing up for a round trip with a long middle. You are signing up for a one-way departure with an audience on the other end. That clause is the door, and it only locks the one way. Everything before this table, the physicals, the psychological batteries, the years of training on systems that don't exist yet outside a simulator, was reversible. You could have walked away from any of it without consequence. The signature removes that option quietly, on paper, in a room with bad lighting, months before anyone straps into anything. Later, once the engines are running, the actual departure will look almost anticlimactic by comparison. A scheduled burn, a countdown read off a checklist, a planet shrinking in a window, the door already closed here, at this table, the day the ink dried, and the director filed the form in a cabinet that will outlast the mission by decades. What the door buys, in exchange for taking away your return trip, is the only thing that makes the arithmetic of this voyage work at all. Every kilogram of propellant not spent slowing down at the far end is a kilogram spent getting there sooner, inside a single human lifetime. Instead of several, you will not be the one who decides whether that trade was worth it. That verdict belongs to whoever is still alive to hear from you on the other side of a light lag long enough to swallow entire arguments before they can be answered. You are allowed to ask, at the table, why nobody built a version of this ship that carries enough fuel for both halves of the trip. The director has the answer ready, because every candidate asks the same question. Doubling the propellant does not double the ship's mass, it multiplies it, because the extra fuel needed to slow down also has to be accelerated on the way out, which means carrying fuel to accelerate the fuel that will later decelerate the ship, a spiral that engineers have run the numbers on for decades and never found a way around. A round trip built with today's best propulsion physics would not take twice as long. It would take a ship too heavy to ever leave orbit in the first place. The one-way version is not a cheaper option chosen out of caution. It is the only version the arithmetic allows to exist at all. The pen they hand you is a plain government-issue pen, the kind that runs out of ink halfway through a form nobody reads twice. Nothing about the room is built to make the decision feel large. That absence of ceremony is deliberate. Mission psychologists learned, after earlier long-duration programs, that people commit more honestly to decisions that don't ask to be witnessed. Nobody applauds, nobody records the moment. You sign, the director slides the form into a folder, and you walk out into a parking lot that looks exactly like it did an hour earlier, carrying a decision that the rest of your life has already been rearranged around, whether or not anyone else in that parking lot could tell. Nobody set out to find the nearest star. In 1915, a Scottish-born astronomer named Robert Innes was running the Union Observatory in Johannesburg, comparing photographic plates of the same patch of southern sky taken years apart, hunting for anything that had moved. Stars are supposed to hold still against each other, on any timescale a human notices. Innes was looking for the rare ones that don't. The nearby ones, close enough that their sideways drift through space becomes visible over a few years instead of a few centuries. A faint red point near the bright double star Alpha Centauri kept shifting position, plate after plate, faster than anything else on the frame. Innes had no way yet to prove it was close. He only had proof that it was moving like something close moves. He named it Proxima, nearest, on a hunch built entirely out of motion, before a single instrument had measured the one number that would actually confirm the name. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not how discovery usually gets told afterward. There was no eureka, no single decisive image. There was a faint smudge on glass, drifting a little more than its neighbours, and a working assumption that a star moving that fast across the sky had to be sitting closer to us than the stars around it. Innes published the find and moved on to other plates. He would not live to see the number that turned his hunch into a measured fact. That gap between finding something and actually confirming what it is turns out to matter more than it sounds. A name gets attached quickly. A number takes longer. And the number is the part any real mission would eventually have to trust with human lives riding on it. Innes was, by training, a wine merchant before he was ever an astronomer, self-taught in Sydney on a telescope he built himself before a run of double star discoveries got him noticed and eventually pulled him into South Africa's observatory system with no formal astronomy degree in hand at all. That background shows up in how he worked. Patient, comparative, plate against plate, looking for the one measurement that didn't match its neighbours, rather than searching for anything dramatic in a single image. Proxima never announced itself. It sat, unremarkable and dim, in the same general direction as its far brighter neighbours, and would have stayed catalogued as nothing in particular if its motion across those repeated photographs hadn't been fast enough to catch a careful accountant's eye. The plates Innes compared are still archived. Physical glass rectangles coated in silver emulsion, each one a fixed record of exactly where every visible star sat on one particular night. Multiply that motion out over a human lifetime, and it amounts to almost nothing to the naked eye. The star creeps less than the width of a fingernail held at arm's length every few years. Multiply it out over the 4+ centuries since Galileo first pointed a telescope at the sky, and the drift becomes unmistakable on paper, exactly the kind of unmistakable a careful comparison across years was built to catch. Nobody watching the star for a single night, even with the sharpest eyes and the best equipment then available, could have found what a patient study of 2 photographs, taken years apart, revealed almost by procedure. Proxima Centauri sits almost on top of Alpha Centauri in the sky, close enough that for most of human history nobody separated the two. From the southern hemisphere, on a dark night, the combined light of that system is bright enough to notice, without any instrument at all. Not Proxima alone, which is too faint on its own, but the bright pair it orbits at a wide distance, blazing enough to rank among the brightest points overhead. That visibility is exactly what makes the actual distance so easy to misjudge. The brain reads easy to see as not that far, The same shortcut that makes the moon look close enough to touch and the sun look like a coin stuck to the sky. Nothing about how a star looks tells you how far away it is. Brightness is a function of two completely different things multiplied together: how much light a star actually produces, and how far that light has had to travel before it reaches your eye. And the eye cannot separate the two on its own. A dim, close star and a brilliant, distant one can land on the retina looking almost the same. Proxima Centauri itself proves the point twice over. It is far too faint to see alone, yet it sits closer to the sun than any other star known, closer than every other point of light in the night sky put together. Being nearest and being visible turned out to be almost unrelated facts. That mismatch is the reason this particular star kept getting treated, for most of the 20th century, as background scenery next to its brighter neighbours. A footnote to Alpha Centauri rather than the record holder it actually is. The record wouldn't be secured by looking harder. It would be secured by measuring something the eye cannot detect at all: the tiny, repeating wobble a truly nearby star makes against the fixed background of everything much farther away. Set the comparison a different way. Betelgeuse, the bright red shoulder of Orion that most casual skywatchers can name on sight, sits roughly 550 light-years out. Deneb, the tail of the swan, sits over 2,000. Both are still easier for most of the world's population to notice on any given night than the actual closest star to the sun, because both pour out vastly more light to begin with. Betelgeuse alone could swallow the orbit of Jupiter and still have room to spare, next to a star like Proxima that would fit, with distance to spare, inside the orbit of Mercury. Fame in the night sky tracks brightness, and brightness tracks how much light a star produces multiplied against how far that light had to travel. Proximity was never part of the equation the eye was built to solve. That is the trap this entire mission exists to correct for. A ship's guidance system cannot afford to be impressed by how a star looks from Earth. It has to work from the number Voot would go on to measure 2 years after Ines first caught the star moving. A number invisible to any eye, human or otherwise, and the only number a spacecraft's course was ever going to trust. Finding a moving point of light and proving exactly how far away it sits are two different jobs, done with two different tools, and conflating them is one of the easiest mistakes to make when retelling this story. Ines found the motion in 1915. The distance came 2 years later, in 1917, from a South African astronomer named Joan Voot, working at the same observatory using a technique that has nothing to do with tracking drift across the sky. The technique is parallax, and it works the way your own two eyes work. Hold a finger up, close one eye, and then the other, and the finger appears to jump against the background, not because the finger moved, but because your eyes are looking from two slightly different positions. The nearer the finger, the bigger the jump. Astronomers do the same thing with the entire width of Earth's orbit standing in for the gap between two eyes. Photograph a star in January, photograph it again in July, and measure how far it appears to shift against the far more distant stars behind it. Voot made that measurement for Proxima Centauri and got a number small enough, and therefore a distance close enough, to confirm what the 1915 hunch had only implied. You will be living inside that number for the rest of tonight, so it is worth being precise about it now, before the story asks anything more of it. The star wasn't just moving like something nearby, it measurably was something nearby. Roughly 4¼ light-years away, a figure later observations would refine but never seriously overturn. Two separate people, two separate years, two separate kinds of evidence, and only the second one actually earns the number every mission plan since has had to build around. That distinction matters again later when other claims about this system get made, because a mission that quietly assumes discovery and confirmation are the same event has already gotten the easiest part of the story wrong. The parallax angle Voot measured for Proxima Centauri is tiny almost past the point of being describable. smaller than the angle a coin 1 centimeter wide would cover from 2 kilometers away. Modern instruments have since refined the number using space-based observatories that can hold a target steady for years without atmospheric blur getting in the way, but the refinements have only ever tightened the figure Vogt first pinned down using ground-based photography and painstaking measurement by hand. 4.25 light years, close to 25 trillion miles, has stood since 1917 not because nobody bothered to check it again, but because every later check kept landing in the same place. That kind of number is exactly what a mission plan needs and almost never gets. Most distances in astronomy are inferred indirectly, chained together through several layers of assumption before they settle on a usable number. Parallax to a star this close skips nearly all of that chain. It is one of the small handful of distances in the entire universe measured directly, geometrically, the same basic method a surveyor uses to lay out a property line, which is exactly why a spacecraft's course can be built on it with a confidence almost nothing else in this story will be able to claim. 12 is not an arbitrary number, and it is not a large one. It sits in the narrow range. Mission designers land on once they stop asking, how many people can the ship support, and start asking, how many people does the ship actually need in order to survive its own systems? Failing below a certain crew size, a single serious injury or a single specialist's death removes a skill the rest of the ship cannot recover. Nobody left who can safely repair the reactor controller. Nobody left who remembers the manual override for the recycling loop. Above a certain size, every additional person is additional mass, additional food, additional air, additional radiation shielding, none of which the propulsion budget forgives easily. 12 sits where redundancy and mass stop trading favorably against each other. Enough bodies that most critical skills exist in 2 people instead of 1. Not so many that the ship has to be built twice as large to carry them. It is a strange number to hold in your head next to the size of a graduating class, a jury, or the crew of a large fishing boat. Small enough that, 6 months into the voyage, every voice through a bulkhead is instantly recognizable. Every habit at the food dispenser has already become familiar enough to be mildly annoying. There is no anonymity available on a ship this size, no stranger to nod at and move past. Whatever 12 people bring with them, steady tempers, old grudges, competing definitions of a joke, becomes the entire social weather of the voyage, because there is no larger population to dilute it into. That smallness is also the ship's greatest single point of failure. Long before any engine or hull plate gets the credit, a crew that size cannot lose more than a couple of members before entire categories of expertise disappear along with them. The number was never chosen because 12 is comfortable. It was chosen because it is the smallest number the mission's own arithmetic would allow. Compare it against the numbers other long-duration programs have already tested. And 12 looks less like an invention and more like an extrapolation. A nuclear submarine on an extended patrol carries well over 100 people, specifically because a crew that size can absorb losses, rotate through exhausting watch schedules, and still keep every critical station staffed. Antarctic winter-over stations run successfully on crews as small as a few dozen, but with resupply flights waiting on the other side of a single dark season, not a silence stretching into decades. Nothing humanity has ever actually operated has combined a crew this small with an isolation this long and a rescue this impossible. 12 is not a proven number. It is the number that survives on a spreadsheet, never yet tested against the actual years it will have to withstand. Each of the 12 is trained in at least 2 disciplines outside their primary role, deliberately, so that the ship never depends on a single irreplaceable person for anything short of command itself. It is a hedge, not a guarantee. Redundancy on paper and redundancy after 30 years of accumulated fatigue, injury, and grief are not the same thing, and nobody selecting this crew has any real data on how far the gap between the two might stretch by the time it matters. There is no gravity on a coasting interstellar ship, because gravity in the everyday sense of a floor pulling your feet toward it, only exists here because it's manufactured. The habitat is built as a ring, a wide rotating structure attached to the ship's spine, spinning at a fixed rate so that anyone standing inside it feels pressed outward against the inner hull. The same way water gets pressed to the bottom of a bucket, swung in a circle. That outward press is not gravity in the sense Earth produces it. Nothing is pulling you toward a mass, but your inner ear and your leg muscles cannot tell the difference. And for the purposes of bone density and blood flow, the difference barely matters either. The ring has to be wide. And that width is not a design preference. It's a hard physical constraint. Spin a small ring fast enough to produce a comfortable one-gravity press. And the difference in speed between your head and your feet becomes large enough to cause real dizziness every time you stand up, because your head is moving through the spin at a meaningfully slower rate than your feet. Build the ring wide enough instead, and the same one-gravity press can be produced at a much gentler rotation rate. One, your inner ear barely registers as spinning at all. Width solves the problem that speed alone cannot. It is also the reason the ring is, by a wide margin, the largest single structure on the ship, larger than the propulsion section behind it, larger than the fuel tanks that section depends on, because comfort at this timescale is not a luxury item. It is the only thing standing between a 12-person crew and decades of the bone loss and fluid shifts that come standard with true weightlessness. 12 people will eat, sleep, argue, and eventually die inside that ring, on a floor that only exists because the structure never stops turning. Stop the spin for any reason, and the floor stops being a floor. Spin gravity is also incomplete, in a way no amount of engineering fixes. Stand at the outer wall of the ring, and you feel close to a full, comfortable press. Climb toward the ring's center, along one of the connecting spokes, and that press falls away with every step, because the rotation speed, and therefore the outward force it produces, depends on distance from the axis. The whole structure turns around. Near the hub, close to the ship's spine, gravity all but disappears. The ring does not just simulate a planet's pull, it builds an entire miniature range of gravities into a single structure, heaviest at the rim, weightless at the core, and the crew learns to use that range on purpose. Light labor and exercise recovery staged near the hub, sleep and daily life out at the rim where the press is strongest and steadiest. The engineers who first sketched structures like this, going back to habitat studies from the 1970s, settled on a minimum ring diameter wide enough that a full lap on foot takes several unhurried minutes, not because a smaller ring couldn't spin fast enough to work, but because a smaller one spins fast enough to make your inner ear seasick every time you turn your head. Width, not speed, is what makes the floor livable. It is also, on a fuel-constrained ship, one of the most expensive design decisions on board. Every extra meter of ring diameter is structure that has to be built, launched, and then dragged the entire distance to Proxima Centauri, at the cost of propellant that could otherwise have gone toward speed. Every serious proposal for reaching another star within a human lifetime runs into the same wall. Chemical rockets, the kind that got humans to the moon, cannot get anywhere close to the speeds required, no matter how the fuel is stacked, because the exhaust velocity of a chemical reaction is fixed by chemistry itself, and chemistry's ceiling sits nowhere near the fraction of light speed this trip requires. The one propulsion concept that has actually survived serious, detailed engineering scrutiny for a trip this size is not chemical, and it is not science fiction either. Between 1973 and 1978, a team of volunteer engineers at the British Interplanetary Society designed on paper a two-stage vehicle called Daedalus, meant to reach roughly 12% of the speed of light by igniting a continuous series of small nuclear fusion pulses behind it, and riding the shockwave of each one forward, thousands of times a second, for years at a stretch. Daedalus was never built, and it was never meant for this particular star. Its target, on paper, was Barnard's star, 500 trillion miles further out, because Proxima Centauri had no confirmed planet worth aiming at yet in the 1970s. But the engineering underneath it is the real anchor for a modern version of this scenario, and the honest word for it is scaled, not copied. A fusion pulse engine, sized for a much shorter distance, still burning at the same brutal core principle, Daedalus proved workable on paper. Thousands of tiny controlled explosions, one after another, pushing a ship instead of destroying it. The ship you are on carries that same engine, adapted, never test-fired at full scale by anyone before your crew, because nobody has ever needed a fusion pulse drive to run for years continuously, until a mission like this one existed to demand it. That single fact, the propulsion physics is decades old and quietly plausible, the actual hardware is unprecedented, sits underneath everything that happens for the rest of this voyage. The pulse itself is small, each fusion capsule is barely larger than a coin. A pellet of hydrogen isotopes compressed and ignited in a fraction of a second by a ring of driver beams, timed to converge on it simultaneously. One pellet, alone, produces an explosion that would be lethal at close range and unremarkable at any real distance. The engine's actual power comes from repetition. Dozens of pellets detonating every second, each one contained and directed by a magnetic field shaped like a wide funnel behind the ship, so that the expanding plasma from every blast pushes against that field instead of the hull itself. From inside the ring, none of it is visible, and almost none of it is audible. What reaches the crew is a low, continuous vibration through the structure. Less a explosion felt 6 times a second than a pressure that never fully goes away, the mechanical signature of a controlled detonation happening at a rate too fast for any single one to register on its own. That funnel-shaped magnetic field is the engine's real invention, more than the fusion itself. Physicists have known how to ignite a fusion pellet in a laboratory for decades, containing and redirecting the resulting blast, over and over. Without the field itself burning out under the load, is the part Daedalus's designers worked out on paper, and the part your ship's engineers have had to actually build. Every hour the engine fires is an hour that field has never before been asked to survive for this long. On a machine nobody has flown, headed somewhere nobody has been. Nobody experiences the engine as an explosion, and that turns out to be the strange part. The thrust it produces stays well under a single gravity, a push gentle enough that dropping a cup in the galley still looks almost like it does on Earth, just slightly slower, slightly softer at the landing. What the engine actually delivers is not force, it's duration. That gentle push runs for 2 full years to reach the first target speed. And then, once a spent stage is released and falls away behind the ship, for close to 2 more to reach the cruise speed the rest of the trip depends on. 4 years of a push too mild to bruise anyone, applied without a single meaningful pause, until the ship is moving at roughly 1/10 of the speed of light. The body does not process gentle but endless, the way it processes a single hard shove. A hard shove is an event, felt and then over. 4 years of continuous low thrust is closer to standing on a very slowly tilting floor for the rest of your working life. Every day slightly heavier in one direction than the last, until the crew stops noticing the tilt at all and simply lives inside it. That adaptation is not free. Bone and muscle respond to sustained load by rebuilding around it. Slowly, the same way a hand rebuilds calluses around sustained friction, and rebuilding around a slightly wrong axis of down, for years, leaves a permanent, measurable signature in posture and gait that shows up on medical scans decades later, long after the thrust itself has stopped. There is a second cost, less visible than the first. Every one of those 4 years, the engine is also firing thousands of fusion pulses a second directly behind the crew, and containment is never advertised as perfect. No engineer on the design team has ever claimed it is. A working fraction of each pulse's radiation leaks past the magnetic funnel meant to contain it. Small on any single pulse, compounding across 4 uninterrupted years of continuous firing into a dose that starts eating into the same career limit. The recruitment material never mentioned. The ship gets its speed. The crew starts paying for it before the engine has even finished its job. The tilt itself becomes a private, almost domestic adjustment long before it becomes a medical concern. Furniture in the ring gets bolted down at a barely perceptible lean, matched to the combined pull of spin and thrust, rather than to spin alone. Water in a cup sits a few degrees off level, something new crew members notice for the first weeks, and everyone else has long since stopped seeing at all. None of it announces itself as dangerous. It behaves exactly like the kind of detail a body absorbs quietly and a spine remembers decades later, on a scan nobody thought to take until symptoms finally forced the question. 4 years is long enough for an adjustment like that to stop feeling like an adjustment at all and start feeling like simply how a floor is supposed to sit underfoot. Every gram of propellant this ship carries is already spoken for, and the accounting is stricter than it sounds. Reaching cruise speed consumes a fixed, calculated share of the tank, slowing back down at the far end. Actually killing that same speed, rather than flying through the destination system at full velocity, would require, roughly, as much propellant again as getting up to speed in the first place. Because the physics of deceleration is not gentler than the physics of acceleration. It is the identical maneuver, run in reverse, against the identical mass. That symmetry is exactly why Daedalus, back in the 1970s, was never designed to stop at all. Its engineers ran the numbers on a deceleration stage and found that adding 1 roughly doubled the ship's total mass, which in turn meant far more propellant just to get that extra mass moving in the first place. A spiral that made a stopping mission, at the technology available to them, effectively impossible to close on paper. Daedalus was built, on paper, as a flyby. 1 uninterrupted pass through the target system at full cruise speed, cameras and instruments recording everything they could in the brief window available, no attempt to slow down, ever. Your ship inherits that same arithmetic, because nothing about the underlying physics has changed since 1978. The tank was sized for acceleration and for nothing else. Somewhere in the mission's earliest planning meetings, a decision was made about whether to spend the mass, the money, and the additional years a deceleration stage would cost. And the decision this particular mission made was the same one Daedalus's designers made decades earlier. For the same unforgiving reason, what that decision means for the crew won't become fully real until the ship is most of the way there, moving at full speed, with nothing left in reserve to slow it down. Every recruit is briefed on this before the signature at the metal table, in plain language, with the actual mass ratios shown on a slide rather than buried in an appendix. Nobody boards this ship believing it will glide gently to a stop somewhere on the other side. The briefing is honest about the shape of the trip. Full speed reached early, full speed maintained for decades, full speed carried into whatever waits at the far end, with no mechanical means on board to change that plan once the 4 years of acceleration have finished spending the fuel that only ever pointed one way. The tank itself sits behind the ring, a cluster of spherical fuel modules feeding the engine at a measured, monitored rate, and its level is displayed on a screen in the command compartment, the same way any gauge displays any resource running down. Crew members check it out of habit more than necessity, the way a driver glances at a fuel needle on a long, familiar road. There is no version of that gauge that ever climbs back up. Every year of cruise, it simply falls, a little further toward a number the mission's own designers already decided in advance would never be allowed to reach 0 before the ship had done everything the fuel remaining could still buy it. Every uniform on the ship carries a small dosimeter stitched into the left sleeve, a device that does one job continuously for the rest of your working life. It counts. Every crew member's personal exposure to ionizing radiation accumulates on a running total, checked weekly, logged permanently, measured in units called sieverts that convert something invisible, particles passing through tissue, breaking strands of DNA as they go, into a single climbing number anyone on board can read at a glance. That number exists because astronauts flying today already operate under a real, formally adopted limit. Following a 2021 recommendation from the National Academies, NASA updated its standard in 2022 to cap a career's total radiation exposure at 600 millisieverts, a figure chosen specifically to keep the added lifetime cancer risk from spaceflight inside a level regulators consider acceptable. 600 is not a soft guideline. It is the number that currently ends careers early, pulls veteran astronauts off flight rosters, and shapes how many missions any one person is allowed to fly in a lifetime. Your sleeve carries the same 600 as a ceiling, printed on the dosimeter's casing the way a fuel gauge prints its maximum. Nobody on the design team pretends the number was chosen because this mission expected to stay under it. It was kept because removing it entirely would have meant admitting, in writing, that the mission had no intention of protecting its own crew, and no oversight board would sign off on a document that said so plainly. The number stays on the sleeve. What changes, once the engine has been running long enough, is how quickly the ship's own crew is going to make it irrelevant. Weekly checks turn the dosimeter into a small, unavoidable ritual. Closer to a shared clock than a piece of medical equipment, crew members read each other's numbers off the display without needing to ask the same casual glance anyone might give a watch. Nobody talks about it as a countdown, at least not out loud, in the early years when the numbers are still small enough to feel abstract. That silence does not last for the entire voyage. It lasts until the first crew member's sleeve crosses 600, and the number on their wrist stops being background information and starts being the thing every private conversation quietly orbits. The unit itself, the sievert, was never designed with a trip like this one in mind. It was built to describe occupational exposure for people working around X-ray machines and nuclear reactors on Earth. Environments where a bad year could be corrected the following year, where a limit crossed meant a change of assignment rather than a continuation with no alternative available. Borrowing that same unit for a crew with no assignment to change and no shift to end quietly reveals how far outside its intended use this entire mission operates. The number was built for a world with an exit. This crew does not have one. Real spacecraft have already measured what unshielded interplanetary space actually delivers. During its cruise to Mars in 2012, NASA's Curiosity rover carried an instrument called RAD. Built specifically to record the radiation environment a human traveler would experience making the same trip, and it returned a steady figure of roughly 1.8 millisieverts a day once outside the partial protection of Earth's magnetic field. That number, multiplied across a single year, comes to well over 600 millisieverts. The entire career limit stitched into your sleeve, exceeded before the ship has finished its first full year of the 4-year acceleration burn, using a measurement taken far closer to the sun's relative shelter than the deeper space this crew is headed into. The real number for a crew this far from the inner solar system, riding this close behind an active fusion engine, is almost certainly worse, not better. Every fusion pulse leaking a working fraction of its output directly at the hull behind it. Adding a second radiation source, Curiosity's instrument never had to measure at all. Nobody on the design team argues that the 6 to 100 figure will hold. The honest planning documents, the ones not shown to recruits during the early interviews, work from a different assumption entirely, that meeting the crew's medical needs will mean managing radiation-driven illness as an expected cost of the mission, not preventing it. It does not repeal it. Every crew member's sleeve will keep climbing for the rest of the voyage, past 600, past the point where any astronaut flying today would already have been grounded. Because grounding is a luxury this particular ship was never built to offer anyone on board. Medical staff on board track the consequence in a different unit than sieverts. Excess lifetime cancer risk, expressed as a percentage, added on top of whatever risk a person would have carried living an ordinary life on Earth. NASA's own 6 to 100 limit was calibrated to keep that added risk near 3%. A crew absorbing several times that dose over 35 years is not looking at a modestly higher number. They are looking at a meaningfully different one, discussed in the ship's medical logs with the same flat clinical language doctors use for any other chronic, cumulative, unavoidable exposure. Because on this ship, avoidable was never one of the options actually on the table. Nobody selected for this crew was told the number would stay small. What they were told, honestly, in the same briefing that laid out the mass ratios, is that the mission's medical model treats elevated cancer risk. The way a submarine crew's medical model treats elevated risk from a reactor compartment, managed, monitored, screened for aggressively, but never eliminated, because eliminating it was never physically on the table. Once the decision to fly this fast, this far, without a way home, had already been made. Every applicant heard that briefing before they applied a second time, and every one of the 12 applied a second time anyway. Mass stops radiation. That is the entire principle behind every layer of shielding this ship carries. Water tanks positioned to double as a barrier around the crew quarters. Polyethylene panels, chosen because hydrogen-rich plastic happens to be unusually effective at absorbing incoming particles. The ring's own structural hull adding one more layer of simple physical bulk between the crew and open space. None of it works by blocking radiation the way a curtain blocks light. It works by converting incoming particles into smaller, less energetic ones through repeated collisions, the way a padded wall absorbs an impact by spreading it out rather than stopping it instantly. That conversion is never complete, and the incompleteness gets worse as the source gets more energetic. Galactic cosmic rays, particles that have been accelerated across the galaxy by exploding stars and violent magnetic fields long before they ever reach this ship, arrive carrying so much energy that thick shielding can sometimes make the exposure worse rather than better, breaking a single high-energy particle into a cascading spray of secondary particles that the original shielding never accounted for. Engineers call this the shower problem. And it is one of the reasons naive solutions like just add more mass run out of usefulness quickly, long before they run out of the propellant budget required to carry that extra mass at all. Every additional centimeter of shielding is also, unavoidably, additional mass. The engine has to accelerate for 4 years and never gets to decelerate again. The ship's designers negotiated that trade line by line, protecting the sleeping quarters and the medical bay more heavily than the corridors, accepting that full-time exposure everywhere on board was never going to be physically possible within the propellant budget this mission was given. The dosimeters on every sleeve are the honest record of exactly how that negotiation actually turned out. The crew learns the map of the ship the way people learn which side of a building to avoid in a heat wave. Certain corridors, thinly shielded by necessity, become places you pass through rather than linger in. Sleep happens in the most heavily protected compartment on board, by design, because the body repairs radiation damage most efficiently during rest, and the ship's engineers built the one place guaranteed to matter most around that single fact. It is a strange kind of architecture. A home shaped entirely around an enemy nobody on board can see, hear, or feel arriving. Solar flares, back on Earth, occasionally force astronauts on the space station into a heavily shielded storm shelter for a few hours until the worst of a particle event passes. This crew has no equivalent all clear to wait for. The bombardment they live inside is not an occasional storm interrupting an otherwise calm sky. It is the permanent weather of interstellar space itself, present every hour of every year of the crossing, which is exactly why the ship's heaviest shielding had to be built into daily life, rather than reserved for emergencies that, out here, never actually end. By the end of the 4th year, the engine falls silent, and the ship settles into cruise, a fixed 1/10 plus fraction of the speed of light, maintained without further thrust for the 3.5 decades still ahead. This is the point where popular imagination expects something dramatic, stars streaking past the viewport a shudder through the hull, some unmistakable sensation that the ship has crossed into genuinely exotic territory. None of that happens. At 12% of light speed, the distortion's relativity predicts are real but small, fractions of a percent. Nowhere near the threshold where a human body or a human eye would notice anything different at all. The stars ahead look the same. Your own heartbeat keeps the same rhythm it always has. Coffee poured in the galley still falls the same way it did the day the engine went quiet. That absence of drama is, in its own way, the most dangerous single fact of the entire cruise phase. A ship gliding through interstellar space at enormous but undramatic speed offers the crew no sensory reminder that anything is happening at all. The danger accumulating around them, radiation, isolation, the slow mechanical wear of systems running with no possibility of resupply, produces no shudder, no alarm, nothing the body is built to flinch from. It simply adds up, quietly, in the background of 35 years that will otherwise look, from the inside, remarkably like an ordinary and rather cramped life. Silence, on this ship, is not the absence of a problem. It is what a problem sounds like when it has decades to work instead of seconds. New crew members, in the first months of cruise, sometimes ask the flight engineers to confirm the speed reading is correct, because nothing in the ring feels remotely like a tenth of the speed of light is supposed to feel. The engineers give the same answer every time. Velocity, by itself, has no sensation attached to it at all. Not in this ship, not in any ship, not anywhere physics has ever operated. Only acceleration is felt. Only change in speed announces itself to a body. A body sitting still at any speed, once that speed stops changing, has no way to tell it apart from sitting still at any other speed, including zero. Cruise is not fast. Cruise is just still, moving. This is the same principle Earth itself already relies on without anyone noticing. The planet spins at roughly 1,000 miles an hour at the equator and orbits the Sun at over 60,000, and nobody standing on solid ground feels either number, because both speeds are steady, unchanging, indistinguishable from rest. The ship, coasting at 1/10 of light speed with the engine silent, is obeying the exact same rule at a far larger number. Scale does not create sensation. Change does. And for 3.5 decades, out here, which is precisely the condition under which a crew stops being vigilant, because vigilance needs something to react to, and cruise offers nothing at all to react against. At launch, a message to Earth and its reply arrive within minutes, noticeable, but close enough to ordinary conversation that a crew member can still ask a question and receive something resembling an answer the same day. That gap widens every single day of the voyage, tracking the ship's own growing distance in a straight, unforgiving line. By the time cruise speed is reached, 4 years and roughly half a light year of distance into the trip, a message already takes the better part of a week to arrive and another week for any reply to return. A decade later, the gap has stretched past a year each way. By the time the ship approaches its destination, the one-way delay closes in on the full 4+ years it takes light itself to cross this same distance. Because at that point, the ship has covered nearly the entire gap, and light headed back toward Earth has almost the whole distance still to cross. Conversation, in the ordinary sense, stops being possible long before that final number is reached. Nobody can hold a back-and-forth exchange across a gap measured in months, let alone years. By the time a reply to a question arrives, the person who asked it has often stopped caring about the answer, moved on, sometimes forgotten the exact context that prompted it in the first place. What survives instead is monologue. Long recorded messages sent outward without any real expectation of a timely response. Journal entries addressed to people who will hear them years after the moment they describe has already closed. Earth keeps talking. You keep listening. The two of you stop being able to talk to each other in any sense a phone call or a letter ever meant. Crew members handle that shift differently, and mission psychologists track the difference closely because it turns out to predict almost everything else about how a person copes with the rest of the voyage. Some stop sending messages home almost entirely within the first decade. Unable to sustain a relationship with someone whose replies keep answering questions from years earlier, others lean harder into the ritual, recording messages addressed less to any specific person on Earth than to whoever, eventually, might be listening. A shift from correspondence to something closer to testimony, written for an audience that hasn't been born yet or hasn't started listening yet, long before anyone on board consciously decides that's what they've begun doing. Mission control on the ground faces its own version of the same drift. Quieter, but just as real. The specific people who trained this crew, argued with them in simulators, knew their voices well enough to hear worry underneath a routine status update, will not all still be working the console by the time a meaningful reply comes back. Institutions outlive individuals. The ship's side of every conversation, further out, is answered less and less by people who actually remember the person who sent it, and more by whoever currently holds that desk. A second, quieter kind of distance layered on top of the light years already doing the obvious work. 35 years is not an abstraction easily held in the mind as a single quantity, so it helps to measure it against things that actually take that long. It is close to the entire span of a standard working career. Start to retirement, lived out entirely inside a habitat ring, smaller than a city block. It is longer than most marriages last. Longer than most parents spend raising a child from birth through that child leaving home, longer than the vast majority of professional athletes' entire careers, repeated more than 3 times over. A crew member who boards this ship in their early 30s, near the front edge of adulthood, disembarks. If disembarking is even the right word for what happens at the far end, closer to 70, having spent the entire distance between early adulthood and old age enclosed inside the same rotating structure with the same 11 other people. Children born during the voyage, if the mission allows it, will grow up never having felt planetary gravity, never having seen an unenclosed sky, their entire understanding of outside limited to a corridor that curves back on itself within a few hundred meters in either direction. Whether raising a child under those conditions is even ethical is a question mission planners argue over long before launch and never fully resolve because there is no comparable precedent anywhere in human history to test the argument against. What 35 years mostly means, in practice, is that this is not a voyage. It is the entire remaining shape of a life, rearranged around a single sustained purpose that will not resolve one way or another until most of that life has already been spent reaching it. Birthdays still get marked, out of habit more than celebration, because a calendar has to mean something, even 4 light years from the place that invented it. The crew keeps Earth dates running in parallel, with a second calendar counted purely in mission days, and by the later years almost everyone has quietly stopped translating between the two without effort. Mission Day 6000 means more, day to day, than whatever season it corresponds to on a planet none of them have touched in a decade. That is not forgetting where you came from. It is what 35 years does to which clock a person's body actually trusts. Nothing about that length was hidden at recruitment, and nothing about it gets easier by knowing it in advance. Every crew member did the arithmetic themselves, on paper, before signing anything. The years mapped against birthdays of nieces and nephews who would be raising children of their own by the time any reply arrived. Against parents who almost certainly would not live to hear the first message sent back. The decision to fly was never made in ignorance of that cost. It was made with it fully priced in, which is its own separate kind of difficult, and the kind no amount of engineering on the ship itself was ever going to solve. At some point, statistically, before the trip is done, one of the 12 stops being 12, and there is a real chance you already know, from the day you sign the form that the odds are not in favor of all 12 of you walking away from this together. Nobody on the design team frames it that starkly in the mission documents, but the actuarial reasoning underneath is simple enough that every crew member works it out privately long before it happens to anyone. Take 12 people, most in early adulthood at launch, expose them for over 3 decades to a radiation dose that already multiplies standard cancer risk several times over. Add the ordinary hazards of any small, tool-heavy workplace, a bad fall in low gravity near the ring's hub, a pressure seal failure during a routine repair, an infection that a fully equipped hospital would handle routinely and a ship's small medical bay cannot. And the honest expectation was never that all 12 would step off the ship together at the far end. It was that most of them might. When it happens, there is a body, and there is a decision about what to do with it, made once, early in the voyage, and never revisited afterward. Burial in space is not an option casually available on a ship this size. Because an airlock cycle wastes air and structure the mission cannot spare, and there is no ground to dig into regardless. The alternative, settled well before launch in a document few crew members ever read closely until they had to, is preservation. A small compartment built for exactly this purpose. Cold, sealed, waiting. The bunk stays empty. The name stays on the crew roster, because removing it felt, to everyone who discussed the wording, like a second death nobody wanted to be responsible for authorizing. For the 11 left afterward, the empty bunk becomes a fixture of daily geography faster than anyone expects. A door passed on the way to breakfast. A workstation nobody reassigns for months out of something between respect and superstition. Grief, on a ship this small, has nowhere to dissipate into a wider community the way it would on Earth. It simply has to be lived alongside, every day, by the same 11 people who will also be relying on each other for everything else the remaining years still require. The message home takes longer to write than almost anything else the crew ever records, and it is never finished quickly. By the time it reaches Earth, months or years after the death itself, the person reading it is receiving news that, for the crew, has already been lived with, mourned, and folded into the daily routine of the ship for a long while. Grief arrives on Earth, already old. That mismatch, a loss that is fresh on one end of the message and stale on the other, has no real precedent in any ordinary human relationship. And mission counselors, briefing families before launch, never fully manage to prepare anyone for how strange it actually feels once it happens. What the crew does keep, deliberately, is function. The dead crew members' duties get redistributed within days, not out of coldness, but because the ship's systems do not pause for mourning. And the remaining 11 understand, without needing to discuss it, that keeping everything running is itself a form of honoring the one job the departed can no longer help finish. The ship does not stop. It cannot. The nearest the crew comes to a funeral is a single shared meal, eaten together in near silence, before returning to the maintenance schedule the next morning, exactly on time. An abort is theoretically available to you for a portion of the voyage, not a return home, which the fuel budget already ruled out entirely, but a different kind of abort. Cutting the mission short, decelerating as much as the remaining propellant allows, and settling for whatever partial data an early, incomplete approach could gather. That option exists only as long as enough fuel remains to actually slow the ship down by a meaningful amount. Past a specific point, calculated once before launch and never seriously revisited since, the remaining propellant becomes too small to change the ship's trajectory in any way that matters. From that point forward, the mission is not a plan anymore. It is a fact already in motion, arriving at Proxima Centauri whether anyone aboard still wants it to or not. That threshold arrives quietly, without ceremony, somewhere in the second decade of cruise. A fuel tank reading crossing a number written down years earlier by an engineer who is, by that point, likely retired or dead. No alarm sounds, no vote gets taken. The ship's own control system logs the crossing automatically, appends it to the mission record, and continues exactly as it was already going. Crew members who choose to know the exact date find it in the logs. Some do, others, by their own account afterward, preferred not to carry a specific day attached to the moment their own agency over the mission's shape formally ended. What remains after that threshold is not powerlessness exactly. The crew still runs every system, still makes every decision about how the remaining years are lived, still chooses, individually, how to spend a life that continues regardless. What ends is only the illusion that any of those choices could still redirect where the ship itself is going. The destination stopped being a decision. It became, simply, the future. Mission psychologists, in the years of preparation before launch, spent real time worrying about this exact moment more than almost any other single event in the Voyager's design, because it is the point where a crew member's relationship to the mission fundamentally changes. Before it, a person can still tell themselves, honestly, that they are participating in an ongoing choice, made freshly every day. After it, participation becomes something closer to resonance. Living inside a decision that was made once, years earlier, and can no longer be revised by anyone currently alive to want to revise it. Some crew members describe the shift as a relief. Oddly, once it finally happens, an argument they have carried privately for years about whether this was still the right call simply runs out of anything left to argue about. Others describe losing something they didn't realize they still needed until it was gone. The engineers who calculated the exact threshold back on Earth never met the crew who would eventually live past it. That is, in its own quiet way, the most honest description of the entire mission available. A decision made by people who will not be there when it finally, irreversibly, takes effect. Researchers who study people confined together for long stretches. Antarctic winter over crews sealed in for months of continuous darkness. And separately, crews on long-duration orbital missions have identified a pattern that shows up often enough to have earned its own name. The third quarter phenomenon. Break any long isolation into quarters, and the third one, the stretch just past the midpoint, is where the most friction, the worst sleep, and the sharpest interpersonal conflict tend to concentrate, more reliably than at the start, when the mission still feels fresh, or at the very end, when its finish line is finally visible. Nobody fully agrees yet on why the third quarter behaves this way, and being honest about that disagreement matters more than pretending the science is settled. One explanation says it's about expectation. People brace hardest for a mission's beginning and its end, and the long middle, no longer novel and not yet nearly over, is where bracing runs out first. A second explanation points to accumulated fatigue outpacing any single crisis. No dramatic event triggers the decline, just the slow compounding of small grievances with nowhere to be aired. Some more recent studies find the pattern weaker than earlier research claimed, present in some crews and nearly absent in others, which is itself a piece of honest evidence. Isolation psychology is not yet a solved science. On Earth or anywhere past it, what every version of the research agrees on is the scale problem this crew now has to live through. The studies behind the third quarter phenomenon were built from missions lasting months. An Antarctic winter, an orbital stay measured at most in little more than a year. This ship's third quarter does not last months. Measured against a 35-year cruise, the roughly 9-year stretch on either side of the midpoint sits well past anything Antarctic or orbital psychology has ever actually observed, extrapolated rather than measured. Because nobody, anywhere, has ever run this experiment for this long before this crew. The ship's own psychologists, monitoring mood and sleep data continuously, rather than waiting for a crisis to announce itself, Watch for the same early markers the Antarctic literature flags: small increases in irritability, subtle drops in sleep quality, growing gaps between when a problem starts and when someone finally mentions it out loud. What they cannot do is reassure anyone that the pattern will resolve on the same schedule it resolves on Earth, because there is no precedent long enough to promise that. The mission's honest working assumption, written into its own psychological support protocols, is that this crew may pass through several extended low periods rather than one, spaced unevenly across a stretch of isolation no earlier study was ever built to measure. There is no small room, physically, that fixes any of this. The phrase describes a psychological space, not an actual compartment on the ship's deck plan, but you and the rest of the crew, informally, over the years, start using it that way anyway, telling each other you've found the small room when a bad stretch settles in, a shorthand that turns an unnamed feeling into something nameable, discussable, survivable. In exactly the way an unnamed feeling usually is not. The disputes that surface after 2 decades aboard rarely resemble the disputes you expected before launch. Mission psychologists, planning for conflict in advance, prepared the crew for disagreements over command decisions, over resource allocation, over the large structural choices. A voyage this long inevitably forces what actually recurs year after year, according to the ship's own counseling logs, is smaller and stranger. A particular way someone chews, a joke repeated one time too many, the same 3 words a crewmate always uses to start a sentence, worn down to something closer to physical irritation than disagreement. Small grievances have nowhere to dissipate on a ship this size. On Earth, an annoying co-worker gets diluted across an entire life. Other friends, other rooms, the simple option of a walk outside to cool off before returning. None of that dilution exists in a ring shared permanently by 11 other specific people. None of them optional, none of them replaceable, all of them present at every meal for years running. A minor irritation that would fade naturally in a larger population instead compounds, quietly, into something the crew's counseling protocols now treat as seriously as any physical injury. Because left untreated, it behaves like one. Eating slowly at a resource just as essential to the mission's survival as fuel or air. The mission's answer, refined gradually over the voyage's early years, is not conflict resolution in the usual sense. It is scheduled distance. Private hours protected on the calendar with the same rigidity as a medical checkup. Small physical spaces within the ring designated for solitude and treated as genuinely off-limits because the crew learned the difficult way that people who cannot occasionally disappear from each other eventually stop being able to stand each other at all. Command structure changes too, quietly, over the decades, in ways the original mission planning never fully anticipated. Formal rank, useful in the early years for resolving disagreements quickly under launch-adjacent pressure, softens over time into something closer to rotating stewardship, different crew members taking the lead on different kinds of decisions based on who has the clearest head that particular month, rather than who holds the official title. Nobody votes to make that change. It simply happens. The way any small group's real internal structure eventually settles into whatever actually works, regardless of what the original organizational chart drafted years earlier by people who never had to live inside it says on paper. Humor becomes a load-bearing structure of its own, the same handful of running jokes stretched, reshaped, and reused for years, because manufacturing new material for the same 11 listeners eventually becomes harder than simply getting more mileage out of what already works. Outsiders reviewing the ship's communication logs afterward sometimes find the crew's sense of humor strange, even a little dark, tuned to a private frequency built entirely out of years of shared, specific, untranslatable context. That strangeness is not a symptom. It is closer to a survival skill, the kind any long isolated group eventually develops, whether it means to or not. Every mechanical system on the ship you live inside ages on a curve engineers know well from Earth-bound equipment. Seals stiffening, metal fatiguing under repeated stress, electronics drifting slowly out of calibration, except that on a normal piece of Earth-bound equipment, a worn part gets replaced from a warehouse down the road. This ship carries no warehouse. What launched with it, in the way of spare components, is the entire inventory it will ever have, supplemented only by whatever the crew can fabricate on board from raw stock, using tools designed decades before launch and never upgraded since, because upgrading them mid-voyage was never physically possible either. The recycling loop that turns exhaled breath and wastewater back into drinkable water and breathable air is the system every engineer on board worries about most, because it runs continuously, under load, for the entire length of the voyage, with zero tolerance for a failure lasting more than a few hours before the consequences turn genuinely dangerous. Backup units exist, redundant by design, but redundancy only buys time against a failure. It does not prevent the underlying wear from continuing to accumulate on every unit simultaneously, backup included. Somewhere around the second decade, engineers begin quietly retiring components before they fail outright, trading a small amount of performance now for a larger margin of safety later, a strategy that works well until the ship simply runs out of components left with any margin still to trade. The fabrication shop becomes, by the later years of cruise, one of the most valued spaces on board, not for anything glamorous it produces, but for the sheer range of small, unglamorous parts it can manufacture from raw stock when nothing in the original spares inventory fits anymore. Crew members with no formal engineering background pick up machining skills out of necessity, because the specialists trained for exactly this work are, like everyone else, aging alongside the equipment they maintain, and redundancy against a single expert's decline matters here as much as redundancy against any mechanical failure. A ship this far from resupply survives less on its original design and more on how well its crew learns to improvise around that design's slow, inevitable decay. Some failures never get solved, only managed. A sensor that drifts out of calibration and cannot be recalibrated gets flagged, logged, and worked around permanently rather than fixed, its readings mentally corrected by whoever relies on it rather than trusted at face value. By the third decade, the ship's maintenance log reads less like a record of things repaired and more like an accumulating list of things learned to live with. A quiet, growing inventory of imperfections. The crew has simply decided, collectively, are survivable enough not to spend irreplaceable parts correcting. Nothing about a critical failure out here resembles a critical failure anywhere closer to Earth. There is no rescue vehicle that could reach this ship in any time frame that would matter, no ground control that could do anything beyond offer advice. Arriving years after the emergency it responds to has already resolved itself, one way or the other. Every repair the crew performs, they perform because nobody else in the universe currently has the ability to perform it for them. Everything this crew is living through has a shorter, real precedent, lived by real people whose names are already part of the record, and it helps to sit with those names rather than the abstractions. In April of 1961, a Soviet physician named Leonid Rogozov was the only doctor stationed at the newly opened Novolazarevskaya base in Antarctica when he began developing severe abdominal pain. He recognized his own appendicitis from the inside, understood there was no ship, no aircraft, and no other surgeon capable of reaching him before it became fatal, and made the decision that no textbook had ever needed to cover, operating on himself. On the night of May 1st, with two other station members holding a mirror and passing him instruments because neither had any medical training, Rogozov administered his own local anesthetic, cut into his own abdomen, and removed his own inflamed appendix, pausing periodically when the effort of the surgery itself brought him close to fainting. He finished the operation, closed the incision, and was back at his research duties within 2 weeks. Nobody rescued him. Nobody could have. The nearest help was separated from him by exactly the kind of distance this crew now lives inside permanently. Not light years, but functionally, for the length of that single night, just as absolute. A different kind of endurance came from a Russian cosmonaut named Valery Polyakov, who spent 437 consecutive days aboard the Mir space station between January 1994 and March 1995. Still, decades later, the longest single stretch any human being has ever spent off the surface of the Earth. Polyakov was a physician himself, and the flight was not incidental. It was designed, deliberately, to gather medical data on whether a human body could physically endure a round-trip mission to Mars long before any such mission existed to attempt. He returned able to walk unassisted off the descent capsule, a detail that mission planners treated as genuinely significant because nobody before him had proven a human body could hold together physically and mentally across a stretch of isolation that long. 14 months, once, was the edge of what anyone had confirmed a person could survive. This crew has already lived past that edge more than 20 times over, with no capsule waiting to bring any of them home at the end of it. A third case never involved leaving Earth at all. Between 2010 and 2011, an international crew of 6 volunteers sealed themselves inside a mock spacecraft outside Moscow for 520 days, simulating, as closely as any ground-based experiment could, the full round-trip timeline of a crewed Mars mission. Communication delays built artificially into the schedule. No fresh air, no natural light, no contact with anyone outside the sealed facility except through the same kind of delayed, recorded messages this ship's own crew now depends on. The experiment, known as Mars 500, confirmed some of what Antarctic and orbital research had already suggested and complicated other parts of it. Mood and sleep patterns shifted in ways that matched some earlier isolation studies and diverged from others. One more piece of evidence that long-duration isolation resists tidy prediction even under carefully controlled, deliberately monitored conditions. None of these 3 cases, stacked together, adds up to the length of what this crew is attempting. Rogozov's ordeal lasted a single night. Polyakov's lasted 14 months. Mars 500 lasted a year and a half, inside a facility with an exit door that, however symbolically, still existed. What all 3 cases actually offer this crew is not reassurance that the distance is survivable. Nobody has ever tested a distance this long, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What they offer is proof that human beings, individually and in small groups, have already faced isolation, self-reliance, and the total absence of rescue, and found ways through it that nobody watching from a safe distance would have predicted in advance. That is a thinner reassurance than a guarantee. It is also the only kind available to anyone on board. Crew training, in the years before launch, used all 3 cases deliberately, screened and discussed as case studies rather than inspirational stories. Rogozov's account gets read for what it says about function surviving fear. His own surgical notes describe a controlled, methodical process even as he came close to losing consciousness from the effort partway through, proof that trained competence can hold even when the situation it's operating inside has no precedent at all. Polyakov's post-flight data gets read for the opposite lesson, that the body, given the right conditioning beforehand and the right monitoring throughout, can hold together for far longer than instinct alone would predict, if nothing interrupts the routine sustaining it. Mars 500's more mixed results get read as a caution against false confidence, a reminder that even a well-designed simulation, with real volunteers taking it seriously, still could not fully replicate what this crew is actually living through. Real distance, real risk, and no door, symbolic or otherwise, anywhere within reach. Every danger described so far has come from inside the ship you are riding. Its engine, its radiation, its slow accumulation of wear and grief. The star waiting at the far end of your trip adds a danger that has nothing to do with any of that, and everything to do with what kind of star Proxima Centauri actually is. The Sun is a stable, middle-aged star that produces flares, but rarely, and even its largest recorded outbursts have never come close to threatening life on Earth's surface directly, cushioned by 100 million miles of distance and a strong planetary magnetic field. Proxima Centauri is a red dwarf, smaller and dimmer than the Sun by a wide margin, and red dwarfs, despite their modest size, are disproportionately violent, flaring far more often, and in some cases far more powerfully relative to their own brightness, than a calmer star like the Sun ever does. That violence matters enormously to this specific mission, because the ship's flyby trajectory, by necessity, passes close to the star, far closer, relatively, than Earth's comfortable remove from the Sun, because the whole point of the pass is to gather data at range no telescope on Earth could ever achieve. A red dwarf's flares are not a background curiosity at that distance. They are a direct operational hazard, capable of disabling sensitive instruments or, at the worst possible timing, damaging the very sensors built to capture the flyby's most important data in the first place. Nobody on the design team learned this late. Proxima Centauri's temperament has been documented from Earth for decades. First through naked-eye brightness surveys that occasionally caught the star flaring bright enough to notice without a telescope at all. A rare enough event for a star this faint that early observers sometimes mistook it for a different, brighter object entirely, before realizing the same familiar red dwarf was simply having a violent afternoon. Later, through dedicated space-based monitoring built specifically to catalogue how often and how violently it erupts, the mission's own approach corridor was chosen, years before launch, partly around that catalogue, not a path that avoids the star's activity entirely, which no trajectory could manage at close range, but one timed statistically to minimize the odds of arriving during the very largest and rarest outbursts. Statistics, however, are not guarantees. They describe what tends to happen across many trials, and this ship gets exactly one. The crew has lived alongside this specific danger for the entire back half of the voyage. The way earlier decades were dominated by radiation counters and empty bunks. Simulations run continuously in the final years of cruise, wargaming what instrument protection protocols would need to trigger, and how fast if a major flare arrived at the worst conceivable moment. There is no version of the plan that eliminates the risk. There is only a version that shortens, by a few precious seconds, how long it takes the ship to react once the star finally shows its hand, and a few seconds against a flare that arrives and finishes inside 7 is very nearly the entire margin the crew will ever get. A stellar flare begins the same way, regardless of which star produces it. Magnetic field lines near the star's surface, twisted and stressed by the star's own rotation and internal convection, snap and reconnect violently, releasing an enormous burst of energy across the electromagnetic spectrum in a span of seconds to minutes. The Sun does this too, regularly, and its flares are closely tracked because of the disruption they can cause to satellites and power grids on Earth. What makes a red dwarf like Proxima Centauri different is not the mechanism. It is the ratio between the flare and the star producing it. Red dwarfs are small, and their convective interiors churn more vigorously relative to their size than the Sun's does, generating magnetic activity disproportionate to their modest overall brightness. A flare that would be a moderate event on the Sun can, on a star this size, briefly outshine the star's own normal quiet output by a startling factor, concentrated heavily in ultraviolet and X-ray wavelengths that carry real destructive potential for any exposed electronics or exposed biology. Sitting nearby, Proxima Centauri flares more often than the Sun does, and its largest recorded flares dwarf, proportionally, anything the Sun has ever produced in recorded history. The ship's instruments account for this in their design, hardened against radiation spikes far beyond what a normal deep space probe would ever need to survive. Hardening buys tolerance. It does not buy immunity. And the difference between the two becomes the entire subject of what happened once, already, at this exact star, caught by instruments already watching from Earth. Size explains part of why red dwarfs behave this way, but not all of it. A star like Proxima Centauri is fully convective through its entire interior, meaning hot plasma churns from the core almost all the way to the surface in continuous, turbulent motion rather than settling into the more layered structure a star like the Sun has, where only the outer third or so convects. That deeper, more thorough churning appears to generate stronger and more persistent magnetic fields relative to the star's modest size, which is the leading explanation astrophysicists currently favor for why small, dim, seemingly unremarkable stars like this one turn out to be some of the most magnetically violent objects catalogued anywhere nearby. The consequence compounds further because red dwarfs like Proxima Centauri also live extraordinarily long lives, burning through their limited fuel far more slowly than a star like the Sun, which means a planet orbiting one is not just exposed to occasional violence, it is exposed to that violence continuously for a stretch of time measured in many billions of years, far longer than the Sun's own expected lifetime. A single flare is a bad afternoon. Billions of years of them, aimed at the same nearby planet, is closer to a permanent condition of the environment itself, which is exactly why the question of what, if anything, survives that long exposure matters so much more here than it ever would around a calmer star like the Sunday. On May 1st, 2019, a team of astronomers led by Meredith McGregor coordinated an unprecedented observing campaign on Proxima Centauri, pointing 9 separate telescopes and instruments. Ground-based radio arrays, the Atacama Large Millimeter Array, the Hubble Space Telescope, and others. At the star simultaneously, for a combined 40 hours of overlapping observation, hoping to catch a flare in the act across multiple wavelengths at once. They succeeded, and what they recorded, published in 2021, became the most detailed multi-wavelength record of a stellar flare from any star other than the Sun ever captured. The flare lasted 7 seconds. In that window, the star's brightness in ultraviolet light spiked to roughly 14,000 times its normal quiet level, an increase so extreme and so sudden that the astronomers themselves described it as unlike anything they expected walking into the campaign. In millimeter wavelengths, captured by the Atacama Array, the star brightened by more than 1,000 times its baseline in the same brief window. 7 seconds, and a star that normally glows faintly and steadily became, briefly, one of the most violent single objects the astronomers had ever directly measured up close. Run that same 7 seconds against this ship's flyby trajectory, arriving at a moment nobody could predict years in advance, and the consequences stop being abstract. Exposed sensor arrays, oriented toward the star for the close approach measurements the entire mission exists to capture, we would take the full brunt of a burst like that at a distance far closer than any instrument recording the 2019 event was actually sitting. A flare this size, badly timed, could blind or permanently damage the very instruments built to make the flyby worth flying in the first place, turning the single irreplaceable pass this mission was ever going to get into a scramble to protect hardware, instead of a chance to finally see the system up close. What makes the 2019 event especially instructive is how little warning it gave. 9 telescopes, 40 hours of combined watching, and the flare itself still arrived and finished within the length of time it takes to read this sentence aloud. McGregor's team caught it because they were already watching continuously, with instruments built for exactly that purpose. The ship's own sensors, by contrast, will be busy for the entire flyby window doing dozens of other jobs simultaneously. Mapping the planet, measuring the star's other properties, recording everything the decades of travel was spent, earning the chance to record. A flare arriving during that window competes directly against every other measurement the mission was built to make, with no way to schedule around a hazard that gives 7 seconds of notice at most. The mission's protocol for this, worked out across years of the crew's own simulations, is not avoidance. Avoidance was never physically available, but triage, a fixed hierarchy of which instruments get automatically shuttered first if a flare's onset is detected. Protecting the most irreplaceable sensors at the cost of momentarily blinding the least critical ones. It is a plan built entirely around losing something, deliberately, in exchange for keeping the parts of the past that matter most intact. The planet you are approaching, discovered in 2016, orbiting well within Proxima Centauri's habitable zone, faces a complication that has nothing to do with flares and everything to do with how close it sits to its star. Proxima b completes an entire orbit in a little over 11 days, and at that distance, the star's gravity has almost certainly locked the planet's rotation to match. The same tidal mechanism that keeps the moon showing Earth only one face, scaled up to a planet locked instead to the star it circles. One hemisphere of Proxima b faces its star permanently, in perpetual daylight. The other faces away, permanently, into a darkness that, on that side, never once breaks into anything resembling sunrise. That arrangement reshapes the entire idea of a habitable zone. A planet at the right distance for liquid water to exist, calculated the way Earth's own habitable zone gets calculated, is not automatically a planet where that water can actually pool anywhere useful. The permanent day side, baked under constant starlight, might scorch dry entirely, while the permanent night side, never once warmed directly, might freeze any atmosphere solid onto its surface, snowing out as ice rather than staying gaseous. Whatever livable conditions might exist at all would most plausibly cluster in the narrow twilight ring between the two extremes. A permanent dawn, circling the planet like a seam, neither fully lit nor fully dark. None of this was resolvable from Earth in 2016, and very little of it is fully resolvable even now. It matters enormously to what the ship's instruments will actually be able to say in the few hours available about whether this planet is anything close to what its habitable zone label originally implied. Tidal locking itself is not exotic. It is the ordinary fate of almost anything orbiting close enough to a much larger body for long enough. The moon is tidally locked to Earth, which is why the same lunar face has greeted every human who has ever looked up. Most of the large moons in the solar system are locked to their planets the same way. What is unusual about Proxima b is not the mechanism, but the stakes. A locked moon losing its far side to permanent darkness costs nothing, because nobody expected the moon to support life in the first place. A locked planet, sitting in the one distance band where its star's warmth might otherwise allow liquid water, changes the entire meaning of habitable zone, because half of that zone's promise might belong entirely to a hemisphere baked past usefulness, and the other half to one frozen past it. Climate models built specifically for tidally locked planets suggest the twilight ring might not be the only livable region if the planet has an atmosphere thick enough to carry heat from the day side around to the night side through constant, powerful winds. Whether Proxima b's atmosphere is thick enough to do that, whether it has a substantial atmosphere left at all, after billions of years next to a star this active, is exactly the kind of question a few hours of close-range instruments, arriving at the end of 35 years, exist to finally start answering. A planet's magnetic field, generated by the churning of a molten metal core deep beneath its surface, does more than deflect a compass needle. It creates a protective bubble that shields an atmosphere from being slowly stripped away by the constant outward pressure of a star's stellar wind. The same protection Earth's own magnetic field provides, largely invisibly, every single day. Whether Proxima b has anything like that protection is a genuinely open question, argued in both directions by working scientists, not a settled fact either side of the argument can currently claim outright. The pessimistic case starts with the planet's tidal lock itself, a planet rotating in step with its orbit, rather than spinning independently the way Earth does, may lack the internal fluid motion needed to generate a strong magnetic field through the same dynamo process that powers Earth's. Under that view, Proxima b sits essentially undefended against a star that, as the 7-second flare already demonstrated, exactly the combination that would make any atmosphere on the planet vulnerable to being stripped away entirely over the billions of years the system has existed. A more recent line of research complicates that picture rather than resolving it. Detailed modeling published in 2024, examining how a molten iron core might behave even inside a tidally locked planet, suggested conditions under which Proxima b could still generate a meaningful magnetic field, strong enough to matter through mechanisms that don't require the same kind of rotation Earth relies on. Detecting a magnetic field directly on a planet this far away remains at the very edge of what current instruments can do, which means the honest answer today is neither yes nor no. It is a live scientific argument with real evidence and real uncertainty on both sides, and it will not be settled by anything short of a spacecraft close enough to measure it directly. That is, in the plainest possible terms, the entire scientific justification for a mission like this one. Not the romance of arrival, but the fact that some questions genuinely cannot be answered any other way. Telescopes on and around Earth have pushed the indirect evidence about as far as indirect evidence can go. Model against model, simulation against simulation, with neither side able to close the argument from 4 light-years away. Only an instrument physically present in the system, for however brief a window, can make the kind of direct measurement of magnetic field strength, of atmospheric composition, of radiation actually reaching the surface. That would finally move this question from argued to known. The ship's own instrument suite was built with this specific disagreement in mind, carrying magnetometers and spectrometers whose entire purpose is to settle in the space of a single pass, a debate that has occupied planetary scientists on Earth for the better part of a decade without an ending in sight. Whether the pass is fast enough, close enough, or lucky enough with the star's temper to actually deliver that answer is a separate question from whether the attempt was worth making at all. The deceleration fuel that was never loaded onto your ship, ruled out by the same doubling arithmetic explained decades earlier in the voyage, finally becomes fully real in these final weeks of approach. There is no last-minute reserve, no contingency burn held back in secret for exactly this moment. The ship crosses into the outer edges of the Proxima Centauri system, carrying essentially the same cruise velocity it reached at the end of its 4-year acceleration burn. Over 3 decades earlier, because nothing in the intervening years ever gave it away to shed that speed. What that means, concretely, is that there will be no orbit, no landing, no extended survey conducted at a comfortable, stable distance. The ship is not arriving. It is passing through at a significant fraction of the speed of light on a trajectory that carries it past the star and its planets in a window measured in hours rather than the months or years. A stationary observer would need to study the system properly. Every instrument on board has been designed for years around this single, unavoidable constraint. Gather everything possible as fast as possible, because the window will not open twice, and nothing about that window was ever going to be avoidable once the decision, made before launch, not to carry deceleration fuel had already been made. The crew has known this for the entire voyage. It was never hidden. Never a late discovery sprung on anyone unprepared. But knowing an arithmetic fact for 35 years and living inside its final consequence are 2 different experiences. And the second one is what the whole crew is about to face together, for the first time in the only pass this mission will ever get. In the closing weeks of approach, the crew's daily routine shifts almost entirely toward preparation for the flyby itself, calibrating instruments against the approach, rehearsing the triage protocols built around the flare risk, reviewing observation schedules timed down to the second, because there will be no opportunity to redo a missed measurement. Alongside that operational focus runs something quieter, harder to schedule. The private reckoning each of the 11 remaining crew members makes, in their own way, with what arrival is actually going to mean. Not a landing, not a settlement, a window, and then a departure none of them chose and none of them can prevent, carrying them onward into whatever comes after. Some crew members describe, in journal entries recorded during this stretch, a strange calm settling in once the anticipation finally has a fixed date attached to it. After decades of abstraction, others describe the opposite. Grief arriving early, mourning an arrival that was never going to be the homecoming the word implied. Even before the flyby itself has actually happened, both reactions get logged, without judgment, by a mission psychology team that has spent 35 years learning that there is no single correct way to feel about a life spent this way, and that the final weeks before a fixed, unmovable event tend to surface exactly the feelings a crew spent decades managing to postpone. Strip away the decades of build-up, and the honest answer to the question this entire journey was built to test comes down to a small number of facts that no amount of hope changes. You could reach Proxima Centauri using propulsion physics that real engineers have already worked out on paper since the 1970s inside a single working human lifetime. A genuine achievement, and not a small one. Getting there would cost that crew a radiation dose no astronaut flying today has ever been permitted to absorb, delivered continuously across decades with no possibility of evacuation, treatment, or relief beyond what 12 trained people could improvise for each other. Alone. It would cost most of them the ordinary shape of a human life. Marriages, children raised on solid ground, aging parents seen again in person, replaced by a life lived entirely inside a rotating ring. In conversation with home stretched past the point where conversation still means anything. And, at the end of all of it, the ship would not stop. The same arithmetic that makes the outbound trip possible within one lifetime is the arithmetic that rules out ever slowing down again once cruise speed is reached, which means the destination this crew spent 35 years reaching is not a place they arrive at, in any sense that word usually carries. It is a place they pass through, at enormous speed, past a star violent enough to blind their instruments in 7 unpredictable seconds, toward a planet whose most basic habitability questions remain unresolved, even at closest approach. That is what would actually happen. Not failure. Exactly every physical law involved has been understood for decades. And nothing about the mission profile requires inventing new physics to make it work. But not the arrival the word journey usually implies either. A lifetime spent closing the distance. A body spent paying for the speed that closed it. And a destination that offers, in exchange for everything spent reaching it, a single uninterrupted pass and nothing more. It is worth being precise about what this answer is not. It is not a claim that interstellar travel is impossible. The physics closes. The engineering has been sketched in real, dated, peer-scrutinized detail since 1978, and a version of this mission really could be built with technology that does not require any undiscovered breakthrough. It is also not a claim that nobody should attempt it. 12 people, in this scenario, chose to anyway, with the full arithmetic disclosed to them in advance, at a metal table under bad lighting, months before any of it became irreversible. What the honest answer actually says is narrower and colder than either extreme. The gap between we could reach another star and we could live there, or come home again, or even properly stop, is not a gap current engineering closes. That distinction is the entire difference between the version of this story imagination tends to supply and the version the actual numbers support. Imagination tends to skip straight from launch to landfall. The hard part assumed away, the crew stepping out into new sunlight at the end. The numbers insist on the decades in between. On the radiation counter climbing past every limit anyone currently flying is allowed to cross. On a fuel tank that was never going to carry a way to stop, On a star that can end a mission in 7 seconds, it gives no warning before delivering. What would actually happen is not the story where a crew arrives. It is the story where a crew pays, in full, for a single pass through a system that was always going to keep moving away from them the moment they reached it. The flyby window you spent 35 years earning lasts, from first useful measurement to last, somewhere on the order of a single day. Vanishingly short set against 35 years of travel, and shorter still set against the 4+ centuries humanity had, by that point, spent simply wondering what this particular star and its planet actually looked like up close. Inside that window, every instrument the ship carries runs at full capacity simultaneously for the first and only time in the entire mission. Spectrometers reading the planet's atmosphere for the chemical fingerprints that might indicate water or its absence. Magnetometers reaching for the field strength that would finally settle the argument decades of Earth-based modeling never could. Cameras capturing resolution no telescope, however large, could ever achieve from 4 light-years away, simply by virtue of finally, physically, being close. There is no pause button available anywhere in that day. Every measurement happens once. At the moment the ship's trajectory carries it into position to take it, and every measurement missed, through a mistimed flare, a malfunctioning sensor, a decision made a half-second too late, is missed permanently because the ship's own velocity guarantees there will be no second pass, no return trip, no opportunity to come back next year and try again. 35 years of acceleration, cruise, radiation, grief, and repair converge on this single unrepeatable day, the way a long-drawn breath converges on the moment it is finally released. For the crew, the hours pass strangely. Several of them report afterward, less like a climax and more like an extended, focused blur. Checklists executed, alarms monitored, data streams verified, the accumulated weight of an entire adult life spent reaching this exact moment, somehow subordinated, in the moment itself, to the immediate, practical business of not missing anything. The reflection comes later, in the days and weeks after the star has already fallen behind the ship. Once there is finally time again to feel what happened, rather than simply execute it. The planet itself resolves, for the first time, from an abstraction into an actual place with actual features, cloud bands or their absence, a visible boundary between the permanent day side and the permanent night side. Perhaps a glint that could be starlight reflecting off something liquid. Perhaps nothing of the kind at all. Whatever the images show, they show it once. At whatever resolution the ship's cameras can manage from a trajectory that was never going to slow down to look longer. Scientists on Earth, 4+ years later, will spend far more time analysing each frame than the ship itself spent capturing it, the way a single photograph can occupy a lifetime of study, even though the shutter itself was open for a fraction of a second. Radiation sensors run continuously through the entire window, logging exactly how violent the star's environment actually is at close range, data no instrument sitting safely back on Earth or in Earth's own solar system could ever have gathered directly. If the star stays quiet during the pass, no repeat of the 7-second violence recorded in 2019. The data comes back clean, comprehensive, exactly what 35 years of preparation were built to earn. If it does not, the crew will know, in real time, watching their own instruments struggle against exactly the danger they spent the mission's final years rehearsing for, that the flyby's most important measurements were compromised in a window that will never come again. What the instruments record in that single day becomes, depending on how the numbers come back, either the most significant close-range data ever gathered on a planet outside the solar system, or a partial, flare-damaged fragment of what a complete survey might have offered under kinder conditions. Both outcomes were always possible from the moment the mission was approved. Both were priced into the arithmetic from the very beginning, at the same metal table, where the door first locked one way. Once the flyby window closes, the star and its planet begin, immediately and irreversibly, to fall behind you. There is no braking maneuver waiting on the other side. No orbit to settle into, no return leg written anywhere in the flight plan. The ship simply continues, carrying its remaining crew, its collected data, and its steadily aging systems onward at the same cruise velocity that carried it in. Except now outbound, into the interstellar space on the far side of the one star this entire mission was built around. That continuation is, in its own quiet way, the most complete answer this story has to offer to the question of what success even means out here. The mission accomplished what it physically could. A close pass, a day of unprecedented measurement, a body of data that will occupy scientists on Earth for years after it finally arrives home, decades after the crew who gathered it first left. And still, nothing about that accomplishment resembles arrival in any sense that carries weight for the people who lived it. There is no planet to stand on. There is no home to have reached. There is only a ship, still moving, still carrying 11 or however many remain of the original 12, headed now toward nothing in particular. No second star lies close enough along this trajectory to matter. No destination waits to give the outbound leg a shape or a purpose of its own. The remaining fuel, what little was never spent on acceleration, gets allocated in these final operational meetings to whatever keeps the ship's systems running as long as possible, rather than to any attempt at a further destination nobody planned for and no propellant budget was ever going to support. Life continues inside the ring, the way it has for over 3 decades, except now measured against an ending that has no fixed date attached to it. Not arrival, not return, simply the slow continuation of a life and a ship, moving forever away from everything either one of them ever knew. Nothing in the ship's design anticipated a meaningful purpose for this outbound leg, because nothing about the mission's funding, planning, or public justification was ever built around what happens after the flyby. Every study, every design review, every argument made to secure the resources for this voyage centered entirely on reaching Proxima Centauri and gathering what could be gathered there. The decades of interstellar space still ahead, after the star has already receded behind the hull, exist in the mission's own planning documents almost as an afterthought, acknowledged, briefly, as an unavoidable consequence of the physics, and then left largely undiscussed, because there was nothing constructive left to plan for once the propellant was already spent. That leaves the remaining crew with a strange kind of freedom, unprecedented anywhere else in the mission. For the first time since the signature at the metal table, there is no more objective actively pulling the ship forward. No fuel gauge to watch anxiously, no flare risk to wargame, no title-defining flyby still ahead demanding every instrument's attention. What replaces it is something closer to simple continuation, maintaining the systems, maintaining each other, and continuing to observe, transmit, and record for however long the ship's failing components allow. A mission that has technically already succeeded, still running, quietly, into whatever remains of everyone's remaining years. The final major transmission home is recorded and sent within days of the flyby, carrying the flyby data itself along with whatever you and the rest of the crew choose, individually and collectively, to say about the day you finally reach the reason you left. That message takes just over 4 years to cross the gap back to Earth. The full length of the 4-year echo that first opened, quietly, in the earliest years of cruise, now finally closing on itself, the outbound half of the conversation and the return half separated, start to finish. By the entire physical width of the trip, 4 years is long enough for almost anything to change on the receiving end. Some of the specific people the message is addressed to will still be alive, waiting, older than they were when the crew left, but recognizably themselves. Others will not be. A message crafted with a specific listener in mind, sometimes arrives to find that listener already gone. Received instead by whoever they left behind, read now as something closer to a final letter than the ordinary update it was written to be. The crew knows this is possible before they record a single word. Some choose to write anyway, addressed to the person they hope is still listening. Others write knowing full well they are more likely writing for whoever survives that person, an audience they will never learn the true composition of. Separated from them by a gap neither side can close. Earth's own reply, once it eventually comes, faces the identical arithmetic in reverse. Another 4 years crossing back toward a ship that, by the time the reply arrives, has moved that much farther still into the dark on the far side of the star. Conversation, in any sense the word carries anywhere else, ended long ago on this voyage. What survives instead is something closer to a slow exchange of testimony between two places that will never again occupy the same moment in time. Not conversation, but a form of witness. Each side speaking honestly into a gap the other side will only ever hear across. Never truly close. Mission Control's reply, when it finally arrives, is by necessity addressed to a crew that has, by then, aged 4 more years beyond whoever recorded the message it is responding to. Grief processed, milestones passed, in some cases further losses accumulated that the reply itself has no way of knowing about yet, because those losses, too, are still years from being reported back across the same widening gap. Every exchange this late in the mission is less a dialogue than 2 separate monologues, launched years apart, crossing each other silently in the dark without ever quite meeting in the same present moment either side is actually living in. What makes the crew keep sending them anyway, decade after decade, is not the expectation of a timely answer. That expectation died somewhere in the first 10 years of crews, quietly, without anyone formally declaring it dead. It is something closer to responsibility to the record itself. Proof, eventually received by someone, that the mission continued, that the crew continued, that whatever became of this voyage was witnessed and reported honestly by the people who actually lived it, rather than left to be inferred, years later, from silence alone. Set against all of that, the ordinary night you are actually spending right now. A bed, a ceiling, the particular quiet of wherever you happen to be listening from, is not a smaller story than the one this ship is living. It is the story the entire voyage was measured against from the very beginning, the baseline every sacrifice on board was calculated relative to. A crew spent 35 years, a body's worth of radiation, and in some cases a life, to buy a single day's close look at a star that has been sitting in the sky, largely unremarked, for as long as human beings have had a word for star at all. You did not have to spend any of that. The same star the ship travelled 35 years to reach is, tonight, doing exactly what it has done every night of your life, sitting quietly in a part of the sky most people never specifically look for, 4 light years away, requiring nothing from you but the ordinary act of being somewhere Earth's own gravity still holds you down without asking anything in return. That is not a small comparison. It is the entire comparison this journey exists to make legible, not that the ship's sacrifice was wasted, but that the life it was measured against, the one you are living right now, was never the lesser half of the equation to begin with. Every ordinary fact of your night carries a version of the cost this crew paid to obtain the same thing artificially, decades into their voyage. The floor under you holds you down without a rotating ring built specifically to manufacture that sensation out of raw structural engineering. The air around you replenishes itself without a closed-loop recycling system running continuously at the edge of its tolerances. The people who matter to you are, in all likelihood, a phone call away rather than a 4-year transmission delay away. Close enough that a disagreement can still be resolved the same afternoon it starts, rather than debated across a gap wide enough to make the argument itself feel foolish by the time either side gets to respond. None of that ordinariness required a metal table, a signature, or a decision that could never be undone. It is simply what already surrounds you, freely, tonight. Which is exactly why a mission like this one, spending an entire crew's collective lifetime to manufacture a pale approximation of conditions you already have for nothing, is worth sitting with rather than skipping past on the way to whatever comes next. There is no dosimeter counting against you either, no running numbers sewn into your sleeve, no ledger anyone is keeping of what tonight is costing your body in exchange for being here. Whatever this night takes from you, it gives back in roughly equal measure, the way an ordinary planet with an ordinary magnetic field and an ordinary, undramatic star has always been quietly generous with the people living on its surface, largely without their noticing. The two of you were never in competition. The crew's 35 years and your one ordinary night are the same universe, measured at two radically different costs, and the fact that you get to lie here, gravity working for free, with no dosimeter counting anything against you, is not a consolation prize. It is the actual point, somewhere aboard that ship. If it is still there to be imagined at all, the ring keeps turning, the way it has turned every hour of every year since 4 years into a voyage that began at a metal table under fluorescent light. The floor it manufactures is still, after all this distance, the only floor anyone on board has stood on in over 3 decades, spun into existence out of nothing but motion. Indifferent to how far from home the structure producing it has actually travelled. Whoever remains inside it, reading a dosimeter long past any number an astronaut today would be allowed to carry, still wakes, still eats, still argues gently over the same worn jokes, still watches a window that shows, now, not the star they spent a lifetime approaching, but the ordinary dark of interstellar space on its far side. The same dark, functionally, that surrounded the ship on its way in, except now there is nothing ahead of it to reach at all. The pulse behind them fell silent decades ago. Its work already finished the day cruise speed was reached, and the tank that once counted down toward a number the crew was never meant to let hit zero, now sits nearly spent, its purpose fulfilled the moment the ship crossed into the system it spent 35 years chasing. Nothing about the ring's motion, the counter's climbing number, or the tank's last reserves needed the star to still be ahead of them. They simply are what they were built to be. A flaw, a wound, a fading store of fuel. Regardless of which direction the ship happens to be traveling, outbound now as steadily as it was ever inbound. The one-way door, all these decades later, has never once reopened, and nothing about reaching the star it was aimed at ever gave it a reason to. It closed at a metal table, under fluorescent light, on an ordinary morning that only became extraordinary in hindsight, and it stayed closed through the acceleration, the cruise, the losses, the flare, and the single unrepeatable day the entire voyage was measured against. That is the last image the ring has to offer, once the star itself is finally behind it. Not a door opening onto some new world, but the same door, still closed, still facing forward, carrying whoever remains toward a horizon with nothing in particular waiting on the other side of it. The door that locked, once, at that metal table, is still locked, the same direction it always was. It was never a door back to Earth. It was only ever a door out of the life that existed before the signature. And on the other side of that door, whatever remains of the crew is still living, still turning with the ring, still 4 light years and 35 years and 1 entire human lifetime away from the ordinary bed you are lying in right now. Closer to that star tonight, by simple accident of geography, than any of them will ever be again. The universe will still be here when you wake up. So will we. Good night.